Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the group Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict? What is Global Action doing to reduce the threat of both nuclear and conventional arms? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. There are many threats confronting people around the world today, and two of those deal with nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. My guest today is going to bring us up to date on what one group is doing to try to help reduce the threat of these two items. My guest today is Dr. Robert Zuber. Dr. Robert Zuber is the director of the Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict. Dr. Zuber has written and spoken extensively on diverse human security issues and has organized workshops and conferences in over 25 countries on topics from small arms proliferation and civilian protection to women's participation in peace processes and peacekeeping reform. Dr. Robert Zuber. Bob, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks, Bill, very much.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's talk about the Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict. What exactly is this group? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Global Action was formed in 1999 by a group of three, what you would call international civil servants. And it was meant to originally to look at weapons proliferation and ways to reduce threats of weapons. The project has evolved in the intervening period and has become, we are somewhat preoccupied with nuclear and conventional threats, but we take weapons and we place them into broader human security contexts. So our interest is in reducing the threat of weapons, but also reducing threats that lead people to acquire weapons, to procure weapons illegally, to trade weapons outside of the bounds of conventional legality, et cetera, et cetera. So in addition to nuclear and conventional weapons, we look at mass atrocity violence, violence against women, threats to women's participation. We're actually now working on a book on armed violence and development that looks at the threat to development priorities from illicit weapons and their spread.
Mm-hmm. Now, a few years ago, we'll just focus on the nuclear for the moment. Mm-hmm. A few years ago, the figure they were throwing around was 20,000 nuclear weapons, more or less. It's hard to gauge it exactly to the weapon, but I think that number has come down. I think you have a new number. And the estimate was it costs the United States alone, not just one country, about $100 million a day to maintain a nuclear arsenal. Are we making progress in this area? It seems that there have been some agreements between Russia and the United States. There are other entities out there trying to reduce these weapons, but are we actually making some headway in this area?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Global Action is a substantial but relatively minor player in the nuclear questions. There are other groups called Reaching Critical Will is one, the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, ICANN, which is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, that deal with this more forthrightly. Our concern, and there are maybe 17,300 nuclear weapons in existence at the moment, including Israel's arsenal, which is we're not entirely sure what they have and what they don't. Our concern is twofold. One is to strengthen nuclear weapon-free zones, which is not only to strengthen the treaty obligation, but to strengthen the security frameworks which make the zones possible so that people feel more secure with and without these weapons. And our other concern has to do with nuclear modernization, which is kind of the non-proliferation issue of our time. I made the analogy once in a talk that it's like going from a flip phone to a smartphone. At the end, you still have one phone, but what the phone can do, its functionalities are much greater than the old phone. And what's happening with arsenals around the world is that their functionalities are increasing even as the numbers decrease. So they're becoming more precise, They're becoming more powerful at the same time as their actual numbers are being reduced. So it's a mixed blessing in terms of whether these weapons, whether we're doing enough actually to reduce the threat or not.
And that's certainly a quantum leap from the flip phone to the smartphone, as we all are quite aware. Now, you mentioned about the connection between disarmament and gender, and you do have a new report that came out in 2012, and I'll make sure I get this right. Civil Society and Disarmament 2012, applying a disarmament lens to gender, human rights development, security, education, and communication, 6 essays. So our viewers can go to your website at globalactionpw.org. globalactionpw.org, and tap into this report and much more information on what we're talking about today.
And it's also on the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs website as well, so it can be pulled right off the UN website.
So they could Google that also.
That's right,
okay,
correct.
Very good. Now, we were talking about the nuclear weapons and nuclear-free zones. This is a concept that came up several years ago, and there's been a push to get areas to become denuclearized. I guess Latin America is one of them today.
Right.
That is
no longer. Right.
That's right. And one of the main areas, one of the flashpoints, has been the Middle East, obviously, because of the conflict between the Israelis and its neighbors. How are we moving in that direction? Are we making any headway in this particular area as far as moving towards a nuclear-free Middle East? We see that the Iranians are now discussing, hopefully sincerely and that type of thing, seriously, about reducing or at least eliminating that threat or potential threat of going nuclear. But are we moving forward in that area?
Cautiously. Iranian President Rouhani, when he was at the UN in September, gave a speech to the high-level meeting that was organized by the President of the General Assembly's office, and there were some real breakthroughs in that speech that have been capitalized on now in terms of a formal agreement to ease sanctions in exchange for agreements not to enrich uranium past a certain point. The Middle East Free Zone was mandated by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty process, and so it's not negotiable that these negotiations take place. It was mandated through a treaty process. These meetings have not taken place, much to the consternation of a number of Arab states. And in the beginning, first of all, this is a weapons of mass destruction free zone process in the Middle East. It's not a nuclear zone per se. It has to do with nuclear, biological, and chemical. And the two pillars of the region were considered to be the largest problems. Iran, because of the lack of transparency in their enrichment, and Israel, because of the lack of transparency of their arsenals itself. So in order for the zone to move forward, there needs to be more political will, obviously, on the part of the big powers who are tasked with putting this meeting together, but also the countries that have these weapons need to own up to them, because you can't address what you can't detect. And
Exactly.
So there's still these large obstacles that didn't exist in other zone processes, because this is requiring countries to own up to things they haven't owned up to, but also to dismantle things that already exist, which has not been a part of other zones at this point. So it's a much more complicated process, and then the politics, of course, just make it that much more difficult. So we're hopeful, but cautiously.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you find that there are many reasons that bring people to the bargaining table, that they want to crack a deal or at least look at the possibility of doing it? Do you think that a lot of it has to do with the economic sanctions applied by the United Nations and other countries? Do you feel that there's peer pressure from other countries in that region? You mentioned especially the Arab countries in the Middle East, or many of them are very anxious to work towards some type of agreement. Do you find that there's more pressure building up today than we had maybe 5 years ago?
I hope so. I mean, I think in some ways the politics are more complex. The Saudis are a wild card in the way that they haven't been in the past. There have been some serious human rights abuses within the region, in Yemen and other places, that have called into question the capacity of the region to really move as in one voice on these issues. And again, you had Syria's chemical weapons. We can talk about why they're being dismantled. I don't think there's enough time in the show, but these weapons were always construed as a buffer against a possible nuclear attack by Israel of weapons that they don't acknowledge that they have in the first place. the chemical weapons are gone, that particular buffer doesn't exist anymore. That may provide an opening as well for people to sit down, because it's one wild card that's been taken out of the equation. It's very, very difficult to know, but there is reason between Rouhani's speech and the dismantling of the chemical arsenal in Syria. There certainly is reason to be hopeful.
There's a glimmer of hope
There's
there.
A glimmer of
That's
hope.
very important.
Absolutely.
Well, there are other threats out there also, and we're talking about conventional weapons. We can move into that area and talk about small arms. That's a major problem in many parts of the world. We saw that in April, I guess it was April 2013, the United Nations, the majority of the countries came together and adopted the Arms Trade Treaty,
That's
the
correct.
ATT.
Right.
And that actually took place in a relatively quick time. It's like, I think, after 7 years of negotiations. Now that sounds like a long time, but
No,
in the
but for the
deliberative
UN,
process,
it's a long
that is
time,
good.
yeah.
In fact, even for a lot of parliaments and
Right, that's right.
Congress, that may be a pretty fast time.
It may take some parliaments longer to actually ratify the treaty than it took to negotiate the treaty in the first place.
Agree to
I
it.
think
That's exactly right.
That's very possible. Yeah.
Yes, but anyway, that seemed like a very historic event that took place, and at least to me anyway, it laid the foundation to try to get a handle on the flow of illegal arms. How do you view that?
I'm probably a little more cautious about it than you are. My office was a part of the daily monitoring process during all of the negotiations with Reaching Critical Will. Catherine Prizeman, who's now with Disarmament Affairs, did a lot of that monitoring and contributed a lot to that book. Our feeling about the treaty, because we have a fairly broad human security lens, we cover treaty bodies, we have some sense of how the UN does treaties in other contexts. It's not a great treaty. It's got some holes. It has some challenges in terms of how the treaty can be modified in light of changing circumstances. And again, this is dealing with new weapons and the protocols for them to be transferred from point A to point B. It's not a disarmament treaty. It does not restrict states from producing arms or trading arms. It's not a banned treaty in the way that some of the human rights treaties are. So, for instance, in the Convention Against Torture, the equivalent would be saying, well, torture's okay, but you can't torture in these specific instances. Well, for the Arms Trade Treaty, the arms trade itself apparently is fine. What is not fine is selling arms into situations where they could be used for human rights abuses, taken over, diverted to insurgencies, resold by governments looking to line their pockets, whatever the scenario is. So I think it is a good start. The weapons that have been flooding into parts of Western and Central Africa, mostly from Libya, those are old weapons, not new weapons. You live in Kentucky, I live in Oklahoma. Old weapons can do a lot of damage. They don't have to be new to be lethal. And so there are millions of illegal weapons that are part of trafficking patterns in Latin America, in Africa, and other parts of the world. And the Arms Trade Treaty isn't going to do anything about that. There are other UN mechanisms that work on those problems. Part of our problem, I think, with the Arms Trade Treaty is not that it exists and not that it's a bad thing, but that perhaps it was oversold in terms of its short-term benefits. This is a very, very long slog. And I'm hopeful that governments and civil society organizations have the patience that it's going to be needed to have this thing be implemented, to assess it properly, to make the changes where is necessary, and to link the Arms Trade Treaty to other UN processes that are complementary, including the Program of Action on Small Arms, including some of the UN's human rights treaties, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of my take on that, our take.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at what can be done to help reduce the threat of conventional and nuclear arms. And my guest today is an expert in this area. Dr. Bob Zuber is the director of the Global Action Against War and Armed Conflict. I want to make sure I get all that in this time. And this is a very important area. This is an extremely important area. It's one we don't read about as much as we should, but it's one that we need to focus more attention on. Bob, as we're talking about, we'll get off the small arms in a moment though, but there were a lot of groups that were in favor of the Arms Trade Treaty. and there were some who were opposed to it. One that comes to mind, you mentioned Oklahoma and Kentucky, and it brings
The
to mind
NRA,
the National Rifle Association, NRA, and they staunchly opposed it, saying it was going to infringe on the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, that type of thing. But that really has no bearing whatsoever on that, does it?
No, it's not a gun grab, and I'm, I was a gun owner for most of my life. I wouldn't support gun grabs under most circumstances. I mean, I think we need to do more in the U.S. To regulate weapons and keep them out of the hands of crazy people and people with psychological problems, et cetera, et cetera. But, I was a hunter as a kid. I don't have any sort of moral, intrinsic objections to this. But I do have an objection to misrepresenting things that go on in the UN, and I think the Arms Trade Treaty was misrepresented from several vantage points. The NRA certainly, anytime they smell a threat to their inalienable right to own arsenals of guns, they get a little upset about that, obviously. And there were many attempts, including by me and by others in my office, to sit with the NRA and explain to them why they were off base on this. But this was not a rational judgment on their part. It was a political judgment, and they saw that a lot of what went on in the conference and negotiating rooms was also political in nature, and the UN is a very political place. So it's a very hard place to come up with concrete, objective norms that are going to govern processes. It's usually the politics that eat away at the norms and compromise them, et cetera, et cetera. So the NRA was simply imposing their own political preferences, or trying to, on a process. I don't think they were successful in doing so. By the same token, I think a lot of governments that support the Arms Trade Treaty don't necessarily understand all of its implications. It was something that was successful in a field at the UN that is not always successful. There's been a lot of issues about disarmament machinery, about the nuclear threat and our inability to curb it, about the proliferation of small arms and our inability to curb those. So I think the UN needed a victory, and this was the victory it got, which we're all in favor of, but it needs to be contextualized in terms of where we need to go from here and what this actually impacts and what remains to be impacted by other processes.
Exactly. Of course, it can be strengthened in the future and be built upon.
We hope
without
so.
a doubt.
We
Well,
hope so.
let's shift gears to women. We were talking about
Sure.
your study a few minutes ago, and women play a critical role all around the world in every society, without a doubt. How do you view this as far as gender empowerment? We know the UN developed the UN Millennium Development Goals in 2000. The goal number 3 was to empower women.
Correct.
How do you bring women into this equation when you're talking about nuclear disarmament, when you're talking about gender equality, when you're talking about violence against women? What role do they play, and how do you factor them in?
Yes, thanks for the question. The Millennium Development Goals do in fact mention women's empowerment, and of course there's been a whole series of Security Council resolutions that have been fairly heavily weighted on the side of ending impunity for gender violence, which is obviously a very important thing to do. And gender violence on a large scale, when sanctioned by governments, is legally actionable, including at the highest levels of the International Criminal Court, et cetera, et cetera. These are all very welcome developments. Melina Lito is the person who does this work for us, and if she were sitting here instead of me, she would say that it's crucially important to work on impunity questions, but that it's also important, and perhaps even more important, to work on the participation dimensions. That one solution, in fact, to the issues of impunity is getting more women in positions of power and authority, leveling the playing field, eliminating gender imbalances in policy. And I think that's absolutely right. And part of the reason why she and I and Catherine and Leah and the office and others have worked hard on these linkages, especially the linkage between illicit small arms and gender violence, is not only because of the actual violence that's inflicted by the weapons and the humiliation and the terror, but the impact on women's participation. There are many societies where the price of participation for women is simply too high. The threats to themselves and their safety, the threats to their children and their safety, and these threats have simply got to be minimized. That if you risk gun violence or some kind of sexual abuse because you run for political office, or you demand a seat at the table when there's a policy taking place that affects you and your community, those costs are exorbitant and unacceptable. And so part of what we try to do is to look at all of the policy dimensions that impact women's ability to participate and draw those together into some kind of integrated policy whole.
Which is very important. Well, let me mention that website again. It's globalactionpw.org,
PW,
globalactionpw.org,
Right.
and our viewers can go to that to tap into the report we talked about, as well as all the other items that we've been talking about today. Now, you have 4 main missions, and
Right.
if we shift to another one is civilian protection, and talk about the responsibility to protect, commonly called R2P.
Right.
What is R2P? What is this concept? When was it formed, and why was it formed?
Well, R2P has, like all concepts of the UN, it has a history. Perhaps the most seminal piece of that, at least from my perspective, I'm sure others would argue, is Francis Deng, who was a scholar of renown and then became the special advisor to the Secretary General on the prevention of genocide. And he talks about sovereignty as responsibility. And it's a simple idea, but I think a very powerful one, which is the notion that that irresponsible governments at a certain point begin to compromise their own sovereignty, which is to say compromise the respect that other sovereign governments have for their sovereignty. And that part of that is an acknowledgement that under certain limited circumstances, the international community has a right to protect civilians in situations where the state cannot or will not protect them itself. State has the fundamental responsibility. Governments have the responsibility to help states fulfill that responsibility, but when those responsibilities cannot be fulfilled, then there is a role for the international community. The question, and that all of this was affirmed at the World Summit in 2005, where two seminal paragraphs, 138 and 139, which were approved unanimously, with various levels of enthusiasm, but unanimously, which outline the responsibility to protect and give some sense of where this norm can go in terms of being embedded in the UN system and implemented in practice. And I think the issue for the international community is that at what point does the United Nations, if it is the primary vehicle of implementation responsibility around R2P in situations like Libya or Syria or Cote d'Ivoire or the Central African Republic now, whatever those situations are, at what point does the Council get involved, and to what extent does that responsibility, is it a preventive responsibility as opposed to a reactive responsibility? The UN, for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to talk about, is better at reaction than prevention, but it's not particularly good at reaction either because of the timing of it. And so, for instance, in the Central African Republic, there has been a call for a UN peacekeeping operation. But what the UN has said is that we can mandate a peacekeeping operation, but it will take a long time for it to arrive. It won't get into the field very quickly. And it calls to mind things that happen to us every day in our personal lives. If this studio starts to burn and we call the fire department to come and put out the fire, and the fire department comes 2 weeks later and shows up with a few water pistols, the building is burned to the ground, we're probably dead, all the equipment is ruined. There's no point even in showing up at that particular point, right?
That's a very compelling argument, and of course the way the UN operates, it cannot tax, it doesn't have the authority to tax,
No,
it does not have an unlimited budget, it does not have troops. There are no troops in the UN. They borrow troops from other countries. There are 120,000 in the field right now. But it sounds like you are making an argument that maybe the UN should have something more on reserve, because what they have to do is go out and build the fire department.
No, that's right.
Basically is what happens.
Right,
If
well,
the house is burning, you go out and look
Right.
for the trucks, you look
Right.
for the firefighters and that type of thing, and the money to fund them. And
That's correct.
That's the way the UN has to operate, because they just don't have an independent budget or the ability to raise money like that. Do you think they should have a standing army that's
well,
on
I don't
call?
think it needs to be a standing army, but I think that there needs to be, and there is. I mean, and I must say, hats off to DPKO, because I don't know.
Department of Peacekeeping Operations.
I'm sorry, I apologize for the acronym. You know, to manage 120,000 troops in the field in very disparate situations, contexts, geographies, political situations, and to do so by having to beg for troops, beg for helicopters, beg for finances. I am in awe of their accomplishment, I've got to say. I think it's amazing. You know, I run an office, it's a very tiny office, and I'm drowning in logistics. I don't know how they manage to do what they do. I mean, it's really quite incredible. That said, there are things that can be done, I think, to make the UN a more reputable player in these situations, and obviously one of which is to speed up reaction time. And to ensure that if the UN goes into a situation, it's going in not only with troops, but with medical services. That it's setting the tone for the peace building operation to come. Right. That it's not just putting out fires, but it's setting the tone for how we rebuild societies after the fire is out. And I think that the council. We can talk about the council later, but I think the council needs to do a couple of things. One of which is it needs to do a better job of authorizing things to do their jobs that the council itself doesn't necessarily control. The council is very much into control, especially around atrocity crime matters. And I think the second thing is that the council needs to authorize more on the prevention end. The best fire department is the one that doesn't have to go to fires anyway. That hasn't put them out in the first place.
Well, Dr. Bob Zuber, these are very important issues, and as Director of Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict, you're certainly monitoring them and involved in the discussion. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.